I never thought Christmas Eve dinner at the prestigious Whitmore estate would end with my mother-in-law handing me a mop and bucket, while her entire family watched in cruel amusement. Even less could I have anticipated the look of absolute terror on Patricia Whitmore's face when she discovered exactly who had been quietly purchasing every piece of their crumbling financial empire over the past 2 years. But that moment of crystalline humiliation, witnessed by 3 generations of supposedly superior bloodline, became the catalyst that transformed me from the invisible daughter-in-law they treated like hired help into the woman who would own their legacy, their home, and their future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, though the Whitmore family had never bothered to learn how to pronounce it correctly in the 4 years since I married their precious son Marcus. To them, I was simply that girl Marcus picked up somewhere, despite holding dual master's degrees in finance and international economics from Columbia University. Despite building my own quiet empire in real estate investment that generated more annual revenue than their entire family's combined trust funds. Despite being the reason their son could afford his lifestyle of expensive cars and designer suits on his modest salary as a junior associate at his father's law firm. The Whitmore family represented everything I had learned to navigate carefully in my climb from a working-class neighborhood in Queens to the upper echelons of Manhattan society. Old money that had grown thin over generations of poor management. Social connections maintained through tradition rather than relevance. A sense of superiority built on inherited status rather than earned achievement. They inhabited a world where appearances mattered more than substance, where breeding trumped intelligence, and where anyone who hadn't attended the right preparatory schools was automatically considered inferior, regardless of their actual accomplishments. Marcus had been different when we first met, or at least I had convinced myself he was different. He seemed charmed by my directness, impressed by my ambition, attracted to what he called my refreshing authenticity. During our courtship, he proudly introduced me to his social circle as his brilliant girlfriend, who could discuss economic policy as easily as she could navigate a wine menu. He appeared to admire my independence, my success, my refusal to be intimidated by his family's wealth and social position. The transformation began gradually after our wedding. Marcus started suggesting that certain topics were inappropriate for family gatherings. He began editing my contributions to conversations, translating my insights into language his family would find more palatable. He developed the habit of answering questions directed to me, explaining my positions in terms he deemed more suitable for his family's sensibilities. Each intervention was presented as protective guidance, helping me understand the subtle social dynamics I supposedly couldn't navigate on my own. His family embraced this dynamic with enthusiasm. Patricia Whitmore, his mother, began treating me like a project requiring constant refinement. She critiqued my wardrobe choices, suggesting that my professional attire was too severe for family occasions. She offered unsolicited advice about my career, implying that my focus on finance was somehow unseemly for a Whitmore wife. She consistently mispronounced my name, claiming my actual surname was too difficult to remember, while somehow managing to flawlessly recall the names of every society figure in Manhattan. Marcus's father, Harrison Whitmore III, simply ignored my existence unless forced to acknowledge me by direct address. When he did speak to me, it was with the patronizing tone he might use with a child or service provider. He would ask about my little business ventures, with the dismissive amusement of someone humoring a hobby rather than recognizing a serious professional enterprise. He had never once asked for my opinion on financial matters, despite my expertise, far exceeding his own demonstrated capabilities. The extended family followed the established pattern. Marcus's sister Emma treated me like an exotic curiosity, occasionally asking invasive questions about my background, as if I were a specimen in an anthropological study. His brother James alternated between ignoring me completely and making subtle jokes about my different perspective, that somehow always managed to highlight my outsider status. The cousins, aunts, and uncles who populated their social gatherings viewed me as temporary entertainment, Marcus's rebellious phase that would eventually resolve itself through divorce or capitulation. What none of them realized was that I had been carefully studying their family dynamics, their financial patterns, their business relationships, and their vulnerabilities from the moment Marcus first brought me to their imposing estate in the Hamptons. My background in financial analysis had trained me to recognize the signs of institutional decline, the patterns that indicated when old wealth was transforming into old debt. The Whitmore family displayed every classic indicator of generational financial deterioration, disguised by maintained appearances. Their lifestyle had not adapted to their diminished resources. They continued to operate multiple residences they could no longer afford to maintain properly. They sustained social obligations that consumed increasing percentages of their shrinking income. They made investment decisions based on social connections rather than financial wisdom, consistently choosing prestige over profitability. Most tellingly, they had begun leveraging their real estate holdings to finance their current lifestyle, essentially borrowing against their legacy to maintain their present comfort. I had begun tracking their financial vulnerabilities not from malicious intent, but from professional curiosity and personal protection. My experience in real estate investment had taught me to recognize when prestigious properties might become available at advantageous prices due to owner financial pressure. The Whitmore holdings represented exactly the kind of opportunity I specialized in identifying. Prime locations with motivated sellers who needed to preserve their dignity while liquidating assets. The process had been remarkably straightforward. The Whitmore family's financial difficulties were poorly concealed from anyone with expertise in reading public records, corporate filings, and real estate transactions. Their primary residence, the sprawling estate where they hosted their exclusive gatherings, carried a mortgage that had been repeatedly refinanced over the past decade. Each refinancing had extracted more equity while extending more favorable terms that the family clearly needed to manage their cash flow challenges. When the mortgage came up for renewal 18 months ago, the original bank had declined to extend terms due to the family's deteriorating financial position. They needed a new lender willing to work with their complicated situation, someone who understood the value of their assets while accepting the risks associated with their declining income. Through a series of carefully structured financial instruments and subsidiary companies, I had quietly positioned myself to become that lender. The transaction had been handled through my investment firm, Chen Capital Management, which I had established shortly after graduate school, using a combination of my own savings, strategic partnerships, and carefully leveraged financing. None of the Whitmore family had connected my maiden name to the corporate entity that now held their mortgage, partly because they had never bothered to learn my actual background, and partly because they couldn't imagine someone they considered socially inferior possessing the financial sophistication to execute such complex transactions. Marcus knew I worked in real estate investment, but he had never shown enough interest in my professional activities to understand the scope or success of my operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I discussed significant transactions, he listened with the polite attention he might give to a hobby enthusiast describing their collections. He praised my success in general terms while demonstrating no curiosity about the specific strategies or achievements that generated my substantial income. This willful ignorance served my purposes perfectly, allowing me to operate with complete privacy while maintaining the appearance of an open marriage. The irony was exquisite. The Whitmore family treated me like domestic help while I quietly acquired the financial instruments that controlled their domestic security. They dismissed my professional capabilities while I demonstrated those capabilities by systematically purchasing their debt. They questioned my worthiness to join their family while I positioned myself to determine their family's future financial stability. The annual Christmas Eve gathering at the Whitmore estate had become a ritual of subtle humiliation. that I endured for Marcus's sake and my own strategic purposes. Each year, the family gathered to celebrate their superiority through elaborate displays of inherited wealth, social connections, and cultural refinement. Each year, I was assigned increasingly demeaning roles in the evening's activities, while being reminded of my fortunate position as a beneficiary of their generosity in accepting me. This particular Christmas Eve began like all the others, with Patricia Whitmore greeting me at the door with instructions rather than welcomes. She had spent the past week planning the evening's entertainment, a sophisticated dinner party for 40 of their closest family friends, followed by traditional carols in their music room with accompaniment by a professional pianist they hired annually for the occasion. My role, as she explained with her characteristic blend of condescension and false sweetness, would be to assist with the practical aspects of the evening, while the family focused on hosting their distinguished guests. I would help coordinate with the catering staff, ensure the guest bedrooms were properly prepared for overnight visitors, and generally make myself useful in whatever capacity the situation required. She delivered these instructions as if offering me a special privilege, an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to an important family tradition. Marcus stood beside his mother during this briefing, nodding approvingly at her organizational efficiency while avoiding direct eye contact with me. He had long since stopped defending my inclusion in family social activities, choosing instead to position my utility as evidence of my commitment to family harmony. His complicity in his family's treatment had evolved from reluctant accommodation to active participation, a transformation that had accelerated over the past year as my financial success increasingly overshadowed his own career progress. The guest list for the evening represented a comprehensive survey of the Whitmore family's social ecosystem. Old money families whose wealth had survived multiple generations through conservative management and strategic marriages. Professional elites who had earned their positions through prestigious educations and carefully cultivated connections. Cultural authorities whose opinions shaped social acceptability within their insular community. Political figures whose influence extended throughout state and local governance structures. What united these guests wasn't just wealth or status, but a shared worldview that placed tremendous value on inherited position, cultural continuity, and social exclusivity. They represented the kind of people who believed that breeding and education created natural hierarchies that should be respected and maintained. They viewed diversity as a pleasant concept in theory, but approached actual integration with suspicion and resistance. They treated service providers, regardless of their qualifications or achievements, as fundamentally different categories of people deserving of courtesy, but not equality. As the evening progressed, I found myself increasingly assigned to tasks that blurred the line between family member and hired help. Patricia asked me to check on the kitchen preparations, implying that my presence would somehow ensure higher standards from the professional catering staff. Harrison requested that I personally oversee the bar setup, suggesting that my attention to detail would guarantee proper service for their sophisticated guests. Emma wondered if I might help her select appropriate jewelry for the evening, positioning this as an opportunity for me to learn from her superior aesthetic judgment. Each request was delivered with the language of inclusion while creating clear hierarchies that positioned me as subordinate to family members and barely distinguishable from household staff. The other guests quickly learned to treat me accordingly, directing their service requests to me rather than seeking out actual employees, thanking me for my assistance with the patronizing tone typically reserved for particularly helpful waitstaff. The pattern reached its peak during the formal dinner service. The catering staff had prepared an elaborate multi-course meal designed to showcase both culinary sophistication and abundant hospitality. The family and their guests settled into the elegant dining room for an evening of refined conversation and mutual admiration, while I found myself moving between the kitchen and dining room, ensuring that service proceeded smoothly and addressing any issues that arose. Patricia had positioned this responsibility as crucial to the evening's success, explaining that only someone with intimate knowledge of family preferences and guest expectations could properly coordinate between the professional staff and the hosted event. She trusted me, she claimed, to represent the family's standards, while ensuring that their reputation for exceptional hospitality remained intact. The reality was less flattering. I spent the dinner service managing logistics that the catering staff was perfectly capable of handling independently, while the family demonstrated their status by having a family member available to address their slightest concerns. My education, my professional achievements, my financial success became invisible as I transformed into an extension of the household management system. The guests responded to this dynamic exactly as intended. They complimented Patricia on her excellent staff coordination. They praised Harrison for maintaining such high standards of service. They noted approvingly that the Whitmore family obviously knew how to train people properly. None of them questioned why a family member was functioning as event management, because they had been subtly trained to view me as something other than an actual family member. Marcus participated in this performance with growing enthusiasm as the evening progressed. When guests complimented the service coordination, he accepted their praise as reflection of superior family management. When they noted the attention to detail in the evening's execution, he positioned himself as partly responsible for ensuring such high standards. When they observed how well-trained the staff appeared, he smiled knowingly as if he had contributed to my proper instruction. The transformation was complete by the time the dinner concluded, and guests moved to the music room for traditional carols. I had spent the evening demonstrating my utility while the family demonstrated their authority. I had proven my willingness to serve while they proved their worthiness to be served. I had accepted invisibility while they enjoyed enhanced visibility through contrast with my diminished status. The carol service represented the emotional climax of the evening's festivities. The Whitmore family arranged themselves prominently throughout the elegant music room, their positions carefully chosen to highlight their comfort in this refined environment. The professional pianist began with traditional favorites that evoked childhood memories and cultural continuity, while guests settled into comfortable seating with drinks and holiday treats. Patricia had specifically requested that I remain available during this portion of the evening to address any practical needs that might arise, ensuring that the family and their guests could focus entirely on the cultural and social aspects of the gathering. This meant I stood discreetly near the service entrance, ready to coordinate with kitchen staff, adjust lighting or temperature as needed, or handle any other logistics that might affect the evening's ambiance. The positioning was symbolically perfect. The family and their social equals occupied the central space, participating fully in the cultural ritual that reinforced their shared identity and values. I remained at the periphery, present but separate, included but subordinate, acknowledged but not truly seen. The physical arrangement reflected and reinforced the social arrangement that had developed over 4 years of gradual boundary adjustment. As the evening progressed toward its conclusion, Patricia approached me with what she clearly considered the perfect culmination of my useful service. The kitchen required final cleanup coordination, she explained, and several guest bathrooms needed attention before overnight visitors retired. Additionally, the main entrance area should be properly prepared for tomorrow's departure logistics, ensuring that guests could leave with the same efficiency they had experienced upon arrival. She delivered these instructions with particular satisfaction, as if finally achieving the perfect definition of my role within family gatherings. I had been successfully transformed from potential social equal to reliable service coordinator, from family member to household management resource. The evolution was complete, witnessed by 40 distinguished guests who had observed my willing participation in my own diminishment. The final humiliation came as guests began departing, and the immediate family gathered in the kitchen to review the evening's success. Patricia retrieved a mop and bucket from the utility closet, extending them toward me with a smile that managed to be both sweetly appreciative and coldly dismissive. "Sarah, dear," she said in the tone she might use to praise a particularly efficient cleaning service, "would you mind taking care of the final floor work? You've been so wonderfully helpful this evening, and you seem to understand exactly what needs to be done to maintain our standards. The kitchen fell silent as 3 generations of Whitmore family members witnessed this moment of crystalline definition. Marcus looked away, unable to meet my eyes but equally unable to intervene on my behalf. Harrison nodded approvingly, as if Patricia had successfully resolved a complex management challenge. Emma and James exchanged glances that combined amusement with relief that they had never doubted the natural order of family hierarchy. The mop and bucket hung between Patricia and me, representing far more than cleaning supplies. They symbolized the complete success of a 4-year campaign to reduce me from equal family member to useful domestic resource. They embodied the Whitmore family's fundamental belief that people like me, regardless of our education or achievements, naturally belonged in service positions relative to people like them. I accepted the mop and bucket without comment, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully before anyone could interpret my response. The silence stretched long enough for everyone present to understand that something significant was occurring, though none of them could have anticipated the nature of that significance. "Actually, Patricia," I said quietly, maintaining the respectful tone I had cultivated throughout 4 years of careful observation and strategic planning. "I think it's time we discuss the household maintenance responsibilities in more detail." I set the cleaning supplies aside and retrieved my phone, accessing the secure application that connected me directly to my financial management systems. The screen displayed real-time updates on my investment portfolio, including the detailed status of my real estate holdings and the corporate entities through which I managed my various business interests. "You see," I continued, noting the family's growing confusion as I navigated through financial documents on my device, "I've been thinking about the most efficient way to handle property management and maintenance responsibilities, especially for properties that require such careful attention to detail." Patricia's expression shifted from condescending satisfaction to uncertain curiosity as she realized that my response wasn't following the expected script. She had anticipated gratitude for clear direction, or perhaps mild resistance that could be overcome through patient explanation. She hadn't expected technical discussion of property management procedures. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, dear," she said carefully, maintaining her patronizing tone while trying to regain control of the conversation's direction. I turned my phone screen toward the assembled family, displaying the mortgage documentation that I had been reviewing earlier that evening while they celebrated their social superiority. The legal documents clearly identified Chen Capital Management as the current holder of the primary mortgage on the Whitmore estate, along with detailed financial information about the property's current market value, outstanding debt obligations, and payment history. "What I mean," I explained with growing confidence, "is that as the current mortgage holder for this property, I've been conducting my own assessment of maintenance standards and management efficiency. And I have to say, I'm not entirely satisfied with the current arrangement." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in the Whitmore household. 4 years of careful social control had not prepared them for this particular revelation. The family members stared at the documentation on my phone screen, each trying to process information that contradicted everything they believed they understood about their financial situation and my personal circumstances. Marcus was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What is this?" "This," I replied, enjoying the clarity that came with finally speaking without careful diplomatic filtering, "is the mortgage on your family's estate. The mortgage that your parents needed to refinance when their previous lender declined to extend terms. The mortgage that my investment company acquired through a competitive bidding process 18 months ago." Patricia's face had transformed from its usual mask of social composure to an expression of genuine shock and growing comprehension. "That's impossible," she said, though her tone suggested she was beginning to realize it was entirely possible. "We work with established financial institutions. not little investment companies. Chen Capital Management isn't a little investment company, I corrected gently. We manage over $200 million in real estate assets across 3 states, with particular expertise in residential properties requiring careful renovation and strategic repositioning. Your estate represented exactly the kind of opportunity we specialize in identifying. Harrison stepped forward, his professional legal training finally engaging with the situation despite his personal confusion. If this is true, why weren't we informed that the mortgage had been sold to a company connected to you? Because there was no legal requirement for such disclosure, I explained, appreciating his shift toward substantive questions. The mortgage transfer was handled through standard banking procedures. The fact that I'm connected to Chen Capital Management wasn't relevant to the transaction from your perspective as borrowers. The family exchanged glances that revealed their growing understanding of how dramatically their assumptions about power dynamics had been incorrect. They had spent 4 years training me to accept subordinate status, while I had been quietly acquiring legal authority over their most valuable asset. Emma finally found her voice, though it carried none of her usual confident dismissiveness. But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't Marcus know about this? I looked at my husband, who appeared to be experiencing some form of shock as he processed the implications of information he had never bothered to seek. Marcus never asked about the details of my business activities, I replied honestly. He knew I worked in real estate investment, but he never showed enough interest to understand the scope or nature of my operations. This is ridiculous, James interjected, attempting to restore some sense of family authority. Even if you somehow manage to acquire our mortgage, that doesn't change anything fundamental about family relationships or holiday traditions. I smiled at his attempt to minimize the significance of the revelation, recognizing it as exactly the kind of response I had anticipated from someone who had never seriously considered the practical implications of property ownership. Actually, James, it changes quite a lot, I corrected. For example, it means that decisions about property maintenance, renovation projects, and even basic household management standards are ultimately subject to my approval as the mortgage holder. It means that the family's long-term residence in this property depends on maintaining positive relationships with their primary creditor. The weight of this reality was beginning to settle over the assembled family members. The woman they had spent 4 years treating as household help had revealed herself as the person who literally controlled their household's continued existence. Patricia made one final attempt to reassert her traditional authority, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Well, family is family, regardless of business arrangements. These financial details don't change the fundamental relationships or expectations we've established. I retrieved the mop and bucket she had offered me minutes earlier, holding them, up for the family's consideration. You're absolutely right, Patricia. Family is family, which is why I'm sure you'll understand when I say that I won't be needing these anymore. I set the cleaning supplies down permanently and gathered my coat from the front hall closet. I'll be spending the rest of the holiday weekend reviewing property management protocols and developing new standards for household maintenance responsibilities. I'm sure we'll have lots to discuss when I return. As I moved toward the front door, Marcus finally found his voice again. Sarah, wait. We need to talk about this. You can't just leave like this. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the family that had spent so many hours teaching me my proper place in their hierarchy. Actually, Marcus, I can leave exactly like this, because this is my house now. The door closed behind me with the same quiet authority I had been developing over 4 years of careful observation and strategic planning. The woman who entered the Whitmore estate that evening as a diminished family member was leaving as the property owner, carrying the keys to their future and the power to redefine every relationship they had taken for granted. The December air felt crisp and clean as I walked toward my car, the emerald green dress I had chosen for the evening catching the moonlight that illuminated the estate grounds. For the first time in 4 years, I felt completely authentic in the Whitmore family environment. Not because I had finally learned to conform to their expectations, but because I had revealed my true position in their world. The mop and bucket remained in their kitchen, abandoned symbols of a power dynamic that had just been permanently reversed. The family that had trained me to serve was about to learn what it meant to be served with notices, requirements, and expectations from someone who held the legal authority to enforce compliance. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new negotiations, and new understandings about who belonged where in the carefully constructed hierarchy of family relationships. But tonight, for the first time since becoming a Whitmore by marriage, I was driving home as Sarah Chen, successful investor, strategic thinker, and the woman who had just purchased not only their mortgage, but their respect. The drive back to my Manhattan penthouse provided the first moments of genuine solitude I had experienced in months. The silence inside my Tesla Model S felt profound after years of carefully modulated conversations designed to avoid triggering. Whitmore family sensitivities. For the first time since my marriage, I could think without filtering every consideration through the lens of how it might be perceived by people who had never bothered to understand my actual capabilities or intentions. My penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, a space I had purchased and renovated 3 years earlier, using profits from my first major real estate syndication deal. The design reflected my actual aesthetic preferences, rather than the muted colors and traditional furnishings that Marcus had gradually encouraged me to adopt for our shared spaces. The walls featured contemporary art from emerging Asian American artists, whose work I collected both for personal enjoyment and long-term investment potential. The furniture combined modern functionality with elements that honored my cultural heritage, creating an environment that felt authentic rather than diplomatically neutral. Marcus had visited my penthouse only twice during our marriage, both occasions resulting in subtle criticism about the space being too personal, too distinctive, too obviously reflective of my individual taste rather than our combined preferences. He had suggested that maintaining such a separate residence might send the wrong message about my commitment to our marriage and integration into his family. His concerns had been presented as protective guidance about social perceptions rather than direct demands. But the underlying message had been clear enough. I had maintained the penthouse anyway, though I had rarely used it for anything beyond storage and occasional work sessions when I needed complete privacy for sensitive financial analysis. Tonight, however, walking through rooms that reflected my actual personality felt like returning to a self I had temporarily set aside for diplomatic purposes. The space reminded me of who I had been before I learned to carefully edit my responses for Whitmore family consumption. The first priority was reviewing the comprehensive financial analysis I had prepared regarding the Whitmore family's deteriorating position. The documents were stored in my private office, a room that Marcus had never entered and whose existence he had never fully acknowledged despite my occasional references to conducting business from home. The office contained multiple monitors displaying real-time market data, secure servers maintaining my investment records, and physical files documenting every significant transaction I had completed over the past 5 years. The Whitmore financial situation was far more precarious than even I had initially realized when I began tracking their vulnerabilities. The mortgage I held on their primary residence represented only the most visible component of a much larger pattern of financial stress. They had been systematically leveraging their assets to maintain their lifestyle for nearly a decade, creating a complex web of obligations that required careful management to avoid cascading failures. Their Hampton estate carried a secondary mortgage through a different lender, one that had been increasingly demanding about payment schedules and property maintenance standards. Their Manhattan townhouse, which they used primarily for social entertaining during the cultural season, was collateralized against a business loan that Harrison had used to invest in a legal practice expansion that had failed to generate anticipated returns. Even their art collection, their wine cellar, and Patricia's jewelry had been used as security for various credit facilities that financed their continued social prominence. The pattern was classic among families whose inherited wealth had been gradually consumed by lifestyle inflation and poor investment decisions. Each generation had maintained or increased spending while the underlying asset base declined relative to their consumption. They had compensated for reduced income by increasing their use of credit, always assuming that their social position would provide access to favorable terms and that their assets would appreciate sufficiently to cover their growing obligations. My investigation had revealed that they were approximately 18 months away from a serious financial crisis if current trends continued. Several of their credit facilities would require renewal or refinancing within that time frame, and their debt-to-asset ratios had reached levels that would make traditional lenders extremely reluctant to extend favorable terms. They needed either a significant reduction in expenses or a substantial increase in income to avoid forced asset sales that would dramatically compromise their social position. This vulnerability had created the opportunity I had been systematically exploiting over the past 2 years. Working through Chen Capital Management and several subsidiary entities, I had been strategically positioning myself to acquire their various obligations as they came up for renewal. The process required careful timing and sophisticated financial engineering, but it offered the potential for substantial returns while providing me with increasing influence over their family's financial stability. The mortgage on their primary residence had been the first major acquisition, but I had also quietly assumed portions of their art financing, their business loan obligations, and even some of their credit card debt through specialized collection agencies that I controlled through layered corporate structures. The Whitmore family owed me money in so many different ways that they would be shocked to learn the full extent of their dependence on my continued cooperation. The irony was particularly satisfying given their treatment of me over the past 4 years. They had systematically positioned me as financially dependent on Marcus's generosity and family acceptance, never investigating my actual economic position or understanding that my income substantially exceeded their household's total resources. They had offered me financial advice based on assumptions about my limited understanding of wealth management, while I had been quietly acquiring the instruments that controlled their wealth. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus, the first of what I anticipated would be many attempts to contact me over the next several hours. I allowed it to go to voicemail, preferring to review his message rather than engage in real-time conversation before I had fully considered my strategic options. The voicemail, when I played it back, was exactly what I had expected. His voice carried the carefully controlled tone he used when trying to manage situations that threatened family stability. He acknowledged that the evening had been difficult, and that revelations about my business activities had created some confusion among family members. He suggested that we should meet as soon as possible to discuss the situation and clarify any misunderstandings that might have developed. He emphasized his love for me and his confidence that we could resolve whatever complications had emerged through honest communication and mutual consideration. What he didn't mention was any recognition of how his family had treated me during the evening. Any acknowledgement of the systematic humiliation I had endured over years of family gatherings, or any awareness that my revelation about the mortgage represented a fundamental shift in power dynamics rather than simply a business detail requiring clarification. His response confirmed that he still viewed the situation as a problem to be managed, rather than a reality to be accepted. I decided to let him wait while I completed my analysis and developed a comprehensive strategy for the conversations that would inevitably follow. The Whitmore family would need time to process the implications of my revelation, to research my actual financial position, and to understand the full extent of their vulnerability. Rushing into immediate discussions would prevent them from fully appreciating the transformation that had occurred in our relationship dynamics. Instead, I spent the remainder of the evening reviewing market conditions and developing several potential scenarios for how the situation might evolve over the coming days and weeks. The financial leverage I held provided me with multiple options for proceeding, ranging from maintaining the status quo while demanding improved treatment, to actively accelerating the family's financial difficulties to force more dramatic changes in their behavior. The most conservative approach would involve simply ensuring that they understood the reality of our respective positions while continuing to service their debt obligations on current terms. This would provide me with ongoing influence while allowing them to maintain their lifestyle and social position, assuming they modified their treatment of me appropriately. The psychological impact of knowing that their continued comfort depended on my goodwill might be sufficient to achieve the behavioral changes I desired. A more aggressive strategy would involve using my position as their creditor to impose new requirements and standards that would force them to acknowledge my authority more explicitly. I could demand regular financial reporting, approval rights, over major expenditures, or even direct involvement in their social planning and household management decisions. This approach would provide more immediate satisfaction, but risked creating ongoing conflict that might affect my marriage to Marcus. The most dramatic option would involve calling in their various debts and forcing them to confront the full extent of their financial vulnerability. This could potentially result in forced asset sales, dramatic lifestyle changes, or even bankruptcy proceedings that would completely destroy their social position. While this approach would provide maximum leverage, it would also create permanent damage to family relationships that might be difficult to repair, even if I achieved my immediate objectives. As I considered these alternatives, I realized that my decision would depend partly on how the family responded to their new understanding of our relative positions. If they demonstrated genuine recognition of their behavior and willingness to modify their treatment accordingly, I might be content with the more conservative approach. If they attempted to minimize the significance of my revelation or continued their patterns of disrespect, I would need to consider more aggressive measures to ensure that consequences matched their choices. My analysis was interrupted by the building's concierge announcing that I had a visitor in the lobby. The security monitor showed Marcus standing near the reception desk, his formal evening wear now wrinkled and his usually perfect grooming showing signs of stress. He had driven into the city immediately after I left the estate, apparently deciding that waiting until tomorrow would not be sufficient for addressing what he clearly viewed as a crisis requiring immediate resolution. I considered refusing to see him, forcing him to wait until I was ready for conversation on my terms rather than his schedule. However, his presence in my building represented an opportunity to establish the new parameters of our relationship in an environment where I held complete control rather than the neutral territory that family gatherings had traditionally represented. My penthouse would provide the perfect setting for a conversation where he couldn't rely on family support or familiar social dynamics to influence the outcome. When Marcus emerged from the elevator, his expression combined confusion, frustration, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. He had never seen my penthouse when it was fully activated as a working space, with all the monitors displaying market data and financial documents spread across surfaces that revealed the scope and sophistication of my business operations. The environment provided immediate visual evidence that his assumptions about my capabilities and resources had been fundamentally incorrect. "Sarah," he began, then stopped as he took in the surroundings that contradicted everything he thought he understood about my professional activities. "This is incredible. I had no idea you were operating at this level." His amazement was genuine, though it also revealed the extent to which he had chosen to remain ignorant about my actual achievements. I had never hidden my success, but I had allowed him to minimize its significance rather than forcing him to confront information that might complicate his family relationships. "You never asked for details, Marcus," I replied honestly. "You knew I worked in real estate investment, but you seemed content with general impressions rather than specific information about my operations or achievements." He moved through the office space, examining the equipment and documents that provided evidence of my financial sophistication. "But why didn't you insist that I understand? Why didn't you make sure I knew how successful you were?" The question revealed his continued inability to recognize his own responsibility for remaining uninformed. He was positioning his ignorance as something that had happened to him rather than acknowledging his active choice to avoid information that might have required him to modify his assumptions or defend my position more vigorously within his family. Because I was trying to be the accommodating wife your family wanted me to become, I explained, settling into my desk chair while he continued to explore the space. Because I convinced myself that your love for me wasn't dependent on your understanding of my professional success. Because I believed that demonstrating my worth through quiet competence would eventually earn the respect I deserved. Marcus turned from examining my market monitors to face me directly. And now you've discovered that we owned your mortgage all along? His phrasing revealed that he still didn't fully understand the situation. No, Marcus. I discovered that you needed someone to purchase your mortgage when your previous lender declined to renew terms. I positioned my company to be that purchaser because I recognized a profitable investment opportunity. The distinction was crucial, though he was still processing its implications. So you deliberately acquired our family's debt? I acquired an investment property that offered attractive returns and strategic advantages, I corrected. The fact that it happens to be your family's residence was relevant to my analysis, but it wasn't the primary motivation for the transaction. This wasn't entirely accurate, since my personal relationship with the property had definitely influenced my decision-making. But it was important to establish that my actions had been based on sound business principles, rather than emotional manipulation or revenge fantasies. Marcus sat down across from my desk, his expression shifting from amazement to growing concern as he began to understand the practical implications of my position. What does this mean for us? For our marriage? For my family's relationship with you? That depends, I replied, on whether your family is capable of treating me with the respect that my actual position warrants, rather than the contempt they've shown based on their incorrect assumptions about my background and capabilities. He was quiet for several minutes, apparently trying to process the fundamental recalibration required by this new information. My mother was completely shocked. She spent an hour after you left trying to understand how this was possible. She keeps saying that you never seemed like someone who could manage complex financial transactions. The comment perfectly encapsulated the problem with his family's approach to social classification. They had never bothered to investigate my actual capabilities because they had made assumptions based on superficial characteristics that they considered more important than demonstrated competence. Your mother has been systematically dismissing evidence of my education, my professional experience, and my financial success for 4 years, I noted. She convinced herself that I was intellectually and socially inferior based on criteria that had nothing to do with my actual qualifications or achievements. Marcus nodded reluctantly. She did seem to have very specific ideas about your background and capabilities, but I thought she was just being protective of family traditions and social standards. She was being protective of family hierarchy and her own position within it, I corrected. She needed me to be inferior so that her authority remained unchallenged and her guidance appeared valuable. Acknowledging my actual capabilities would have required her to modify her approach to our relationship. The conversation continued for another hour, as Marcus gradually processed the implications of his family's behavior and his own complicity in their treatment of me. He began to recognize patterns that he had previously interpreted as harmless family dynamics, but which I had experienced as systematic marginalization and disrespect. More importantly, he started to understand that my revelation about the mortgage represented just the surface of a much deeper analysis I had been conducting regarding his family's financial vulnerabilities and social pretensions. When I showed him the comprehensive documentation of their debt obligations and declining asset values, he realized that their continued lifestyle depended not just on my goodwill, but on my active financial support through favorable lending terms and strategic forbearance. They don't know about the other loans and credit facilities you've acquired, do they? He asked after reviewing the full scope of my involvement in his family's financial structure. Not yet, I confirmed. I thought it might be more productive to let them adjust to the mortgage revelation before introducing additional complexities to our discussions. The strategic implications were clearly weighing on him. This gives you enormous leverage over their behavior and decisions. It gives me the ability to insist on treatment that reflects reality rather than their misconceptions. I agreed. Whether that constitutes leverage depends on how resistant they are to modifying their approach. Marcus was quiet again, apparently struggling with the recognition that his wife possessed far more power over his family's future than he had ever imagined. What do you want from us? From me? How do we move forward from here? The question represented the first time in our marriage that he had asked for my perspective on family dynamics without already having formed his own opinion about the appropriate resolution. I want authentic relationships based on mutual respect, rather than artificial hierarchies based on inherited status. I want recognition of my actual capabilities rather than dismissal based on superficial characteristics. I want to be treated as an equal family member rather than a useful accessory who should be grateful for inclusion. These were not unreasonable demands, though they would require significant adjustments from family members who had invested 4 years in establishing contrary patterns. And if they can't make those adjustments, then I'll need to consider whether maintaining family relationships that depend on my continued acceptance of disrespect serves anyone's long-term interests. I replied honestly. The implicit threat was clear, though I delivered it without hostility or ultimatum. The family's treatment of me had consequences that extended beyond hurt feelings to affect their material security and social stability. They could choose to modify their behavior, or they could experience those consequences more directly. Marcus left my penthouse near midnight with a much clearer understanding of the situation and his role in resolving it constructively. He committed to having honest conversations with his family members about their treatment of me and the changes that would be necessary to repair our relationships. He also acknowledged that he needed to educate himself about my professional activities rather than continuing to operate based on assumptions and limited information. After he departed, I spent several more hours refining my strategy for the conversations that would inevitably follow over the next few days. The Whitmore family would need time to research my actual financial position and understand the full extent of their dependence on my continued cooperation. They would also need to process the psychological adjustment required to interact with someone they had systematically underestimated and disrespected. My phone contained 17 additional messages from various family members, ranging from Patricia's demand for immediate clarification of my business activities to Harrison's more formal request for documentation, supporting my claims about mortgage ownership. Emma had sent several texts alternating between apology and curiosity about my professional background. James had left a voicemail suggesting that family financial arrangements should remain separate from personal relationships. I chose not to respond to any of these communications immediately, preferring to let the family experience some uncertainty about my intentions while they conducted their own investigations into my claims and capabilities. The period of anxiety and research would provide valuable preparation for more productive conversations, once they had fully absorbed the reality of our transformed relationship dynamics. The next morning brought news reports about unusual activity in several real estate markets where I maintained significant positions. My success in acquiring undervalued properties from financially stressed owners had attracted attention from business journalists who specialized in tracking emerging investment strategies. One article specifically mentioned Chen Capital Management as an example of sophisticated institutional investors who were transforming traditional approaches to residential real estate financing. The coverage provided perfect timing for my broader strategic objectives. When the Whitmore family researched my company, they would discover not just evidence of my claims about their mortgage, but comprehensive documentation of my success across multiple markets and my recognition within professional investment communities. The external validation would make it much more difficult for them to dismiss my revelation as exaggeration or temporary circumstance. By afternoon, my assistant Maria Gonzalez had fielded over 30 inquiries from financial journalists, investment analysts, and potential business partners who had connected my personal situation with the growing interest in my company's activities. The business community was beginning to recognize that the quiet success I had been building over the past 5 years represented a more significant market presence than had been previously understood. The attention created additional leverage for my negotiations with the Whitmore family. They valued social recognition and professional respect above almost any other considerations. Learning that I was gaining recognition as a serious financial professional, while they had been treating me as domestic help, would force them to confront the magnitude of their misjudgment and the potential embarrassment of their behavior becoming publicly known. Marcus called that evening to report on his family's research activities and initial reactions to the information they had discovered. They spent the entire day with their financial advisors and lawyers, trying to understand how this situation developed without their knowledge, he explained. The consensus seems to be that you've been more successful than anyone realized, and that the family needs to recalibrate their approach to your involvement in family matters. The language was diplomatically neutral, but it suggested that his family was beginning to grasp the practical implications of their changed circumstances. What about their emotional reactions? Are they recognizing how their treatment of me was inappropriate, or are they just concerned about managing a difficult situation? Marcus hesitated before answering. I think there's a mixture of both. My mother seems genuinely surprised by evidence of your professional success, and she started questioning some of her assumptions about your background and capabilities. My father is more focused on the business implications and figuring out how to work with you constructively going forward. This suggested that Patricia might be capable of authentic relationship modification, while Harrison was likely to remain primarily transactional in his approach. And Emma and James? Emma is fascinated and wants to understand how you managed to achieve so much while appearing to be struggling professionally. James is concerned about what this means for family dynamics and whether you're planning to use your financial position to control family decisions. Their responses were predictable based on their personalities and previous behavior patterns. Emma's curiosity represented the most positive development, since it suggested genuine interest in understanding me as an individual rather than as a category. James's concern about control revealed his continued inability to distinguish between demanding respect and imposing dominance. Have they discussed how they want to proceed with modifying our relationships? I asked. They want to schedule a family meeting to discuss new understandings and establish better communication going forward, Marcus reported. They're hoping you'll be willing to meet with them to work out whatever adjustments might be necessary. The request was reasonable, though I wanted to ensure that any meeting occurred on terms that recognized my enhanced position rather than treating it as a negotiation between equals. I'm willing to meet with them, but I'll need some indication that they're approaching this as an opportunity to repair relationships they've damaged rather than trying to minimize a problem they've discovered. Marcus assured me that his conversations with family members had emphasized the need for genuine recognition of their inappropriate behavior and sincere commitment to treating me with the respect my actual position warranted. He believed that they understood the seriousness of the situation and were motivated to make necessary changes, rather than simply managing a temporary crisis. We arranged for a family gathering at my penthouse the following weekend, giving everyone time to complete their research and prepare for substantive conversation about relationship modifications. The location would reinforce my enhanced status while providing an environment where I maintained complete control over the proceedings. The intervening days provided an opportunity for me to observe how quickly news of my financial success spread throughout the social and professional networks that the Whitmore family valued. My assistant reported increasing interest from business publications, investment conferences, and professional organizations that had previously shown no awareness of my activities. The attention created exactly the kind of social validation that the Whitmore family respected most. They would be forced to confront not just my individual success, but the recognition of that success by the broader community of professionals and institutions that they considered authoritative. Their previous dismissal of my capabilities would appear increasingly embarrassing as evidence mounted of my competence and achievement. By the time the weekend arrived, I felt confident that the Whitmore family had been sufficiently educated about my actual position to engage in productive conversations about our future relationships. The woman who had accepted a mop and bucket 5 days earlier was prepared to host a family meeting as a successful businesswoman whose continued cooperation would determine their financial security and social standing. The transformation was complete, and the real negotiations were about to begin. The Saturday morning of our scheduled family meeting arrived with crystalline December sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I had deliberately chosen 10 o'clock for our gathering, early enough to demonstrate that this was a business meeting rather than a social occasion, but late enough to ensure that everyone would arrive fully awake and prepared for serious conversation. My home had been transformed into what could only be described as a boardroom environment. The dining table now displayed comprehensive financial documents, market analyses, and legal agreements that illustrated the full scope of my involvement in Whitmore family affairs. 3 large monitors showed real-time updates of their various debt obligations, payment schedules, and asset valuations. The visual presentation would ensure that no one could minimize or misunderstand the reality of their financial dependence. Maria had prepared individual portfolios for each family member, containing detailed breakdowns of how their personal lifestyles connected to the various credit facilities and investment vehicles that I now controlled. Patricia would discover that her charity foundation activities were funded through lines of credit secured by assets I had acquired. Harrison would learn that his law firm's operational loans had been packaged and sold to subsidiary companies within my investment network. Emma and James would see documentation showing that their trust fund distributions were processed through financial institutions that relied on my capital for liquidity. The interconnected web of financial relationships meant that my influence extended far beyond the simple mortgage on their primary residence. I had systematically positioned myself at the center of their entire economic ecosystem, creating multiple pressure points that could be activated individually or collectively, depending on their willingness to modify their behavior patterns. Marcus arrived first, his punctuality reflecting his growing understanding that this meeting represented a fundamental shift in family power dynamics rather than a routine discussion of misunderstandings. He moved through my penthouse with new awareness, examining the business materials I had prepared and beginning to grasp the sophistication of the strategy I had implemented over the past 2 years. "This is overwhelming," he admitted, reviewing the documentation that revealed the full extent of my financial involvement in his family's affairs. "I'm starting to understand that what happened at Christmas dinner was just the beginning of a much larger revelation." His recognition was encouraging, though I remained cautious about his ability to maintain this perspective when faced with pressure from family members who might resist accepting the new reality. "The question is whether the rest of your family will be able to process this information constructively or whether they'll attempt to find ways to minimize its significance." Patricia and Harrison arrived together, their expressions combining apprehension with the kind of forced dignity that wealthy people display when confronting unpleasant financial realities. Patricia had clearly spent considerable time researching my professional background, since she greeted me with the careful courtesy typically reserved for business associates whose influence must be acknowledged even if their social status remains questionable. "Sarah, dear," she began, her tone markedly different from any previous interaction we had shared, "I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I'm afraid there have been some misunderstandings about your professional activities that we're hoping to clarify." The language was diplomatically neutral, but it represented a significant improvement over her previous pattern of condescending dismissal. "I'm happy to provide whatever clarification might be helpful," I replied, gesturing toward the seating area where I had arranged materials for our discussion. Emma and James entered together, their demeanor suggesting they had spent considerable time discussing strategy for this meeting. Emma approached with genuine curiosity, mixed with what appeared to be authentic embarrassment about her previous treatment of me. James maintained the guarded expression of someone preparing for difficult negotiations, while hoping to preserve as much of his original position as possible. Once everyone had settled and reviewed the basic financial documentation, I began with a comprehensive overview of the situation that had developed over the past 2 years. Speaking with the professional confidence that I had suppressed during family gatherings, I explained how my analysis of their financial vulnerabilities had created opportunities for strategic investment that offered mutual benefits while providing me with significant influence over their future economic stability. The mortgage on your primary residence was just the first acquisition in a systematic approach to positioning Chen Capital Management as your primary creditor across multiple categories of debt, I explained, using the wall monitors to illustrate the interconnected relationships between their various obligations and my investment vehicles. The visual presentation was deliberately impressive, designed to demonstrate the sophistication of my planning while making it impossible for anyone to claim they didn't understand the scope of my involvement. Each family member could see exactly how their personal financial security connected to institutions and agreements that I controlled through layered corporate structures. Patricia was the first to find her voice, though it carried none of the authoritative tone she had used during previous family interactions. "This is quite remarkable, Sarah. I had no idea that your business activities operated at such a sophisticated level. When did you develop expertise in these complex financial arrangements?" Her question revealed that she was still struggling to reconcile my demonstrated capabilities with her previous assumptions about my intellectual and professional limitations. "I completed my graduate work in finance and international economics at Columbia 8 years ago," I replied matter-of-factly. "I've been building Chen Capital Management since shortly after graduation, focusing specifically on real estate investments that require complex financial structuring." The timeline made it clear that my expertise had been well established before I ever met Marcus, contradicting any assumption that my success had resulted from Whitmore family guidance or connections. Harrison leaned forward with the focused attention he typically reserved for business discussions with peer-level professionals. "The legal structuring of these acquisitions is quite sophisticated," he observed, examining documentation that revealed how I had used multiple corporate entities to acquire their various debts, without triggering disclosure requirements that might have alerted them to my involvement. "You've managed to create substantial leverage while maintaining complete operational flexibility." His acknowledgement represented the first time he had ever addressed my professional capabilities with genuine respect rather than patronizing curiosity. The structure was designed to provide maximum strategic advantages while ensuring full legal compliance and protecting all parties' interests, I confirmed. Emma had been quietly reviewing the materials that detailed how her personal trust fund connected to my investment network. "I'm trying to understand how you managed to accomplish all of this while we remained completely unaware of your involvement. Were you deliberately concealing your activities, or were we just not paying attention to obvious signs?" Her question touched the heart of the matter. I wasn't concealing anything, but I also wasn't actively educating family members who had shown no interest in understanding my professional activities. When conversations about my work were consistently redirected or dismissed, I focused my energy on executing my business strategy rather than forcing recognition of my capabilities. The statement implicitly acknowledged their role in remaining ignorant about information that had been available to them if they had chosen to seek it. James shifted uncomfortably as he recognized the implications of years of dismissive responses to my attempts to share details about my professional achievements. Marcus took the opportunity to address his own complicity in the situation. "I think we need to acknowledge that Sarah made multiple attempts to discuss her business activities over the years, but family conversations consistently moved toward other topics. We trained ourselves not to take her professional success seriously." His recognition was important, though it would need to be followed by sustained behavioral changes rather than just verbal acknowledgement. Patricia nodded slowly, apparently processing the recognition that her own response patterns had contributed to their current vulnerability. I suppose I did tend to redirect conversations toward topics that seemed more appropriate for family gatherings, she admitted. Business discussions always seemed so serious and complicated for social occasions. The comment revealed her continued inability to recognize that my professional activities deserved the same respect and attention that she automatically granted to Harrison's legal practice, or the financial discussions that dominated male-centered family conversations. However, her willingness to acknowledge any responsibility represented progress from her previous complete dismissal of my contributions. I decided to address the underlying power dynamics directly rather than allowing the conversation to remain, focused on surface-level misunderstandings. The fundamental issue isn't just that you failed to understand my professional capabilities. The issue is that you systematically treated me as intellectually and socially inferior based on assumptions that had nothing to do with my actual qualifications or achievements. The silence that followed was profound as family members confronted the accuracy of my characterization. Emma was the first to respond, her voice carrying genuine remorse rather than diplomatic deflection. You're absolutely right, and I'm ashamed of how we behaved. We created an entire narrative about your background and capabilities without ever bothering to investigate whether our assumptions were accurate. We treated you like you should be grateful for our acceptance rather than recognizing that we were fortunate to have you join our family. Her acknowledgement was more substantive than I had expected, suggesting that she might be capable of genuine relationship modification rather than just crisis management. James remained defensive, though. His tone was more careful than it had been in previous interactions. I think there were misunderstandings on multiple sides, he offered. Family dynamics are always complicated, and sometimes people misinterpret social guidance as personal criticism. His response revealed his continued inability to accept responsibility for deliberate patterns of exclusion and dismissal. James, I replied directly. There's a difference between complicated family dynamics and systematic marginalization. When someone is consistently assigned servant roles during family gatherings while being excluded from meaningful social or business conversations, that's not a misunderstanding. That's a deliberate choice to maintain hierarchies based on prejudice rather than reality. The confrontation was necessary to establish that cosmetic adjustments would not be sufficient to repair relationships that had been damaged by years of intentional disrespect. Harrison intervened with the kind of practical focus that characterized his approach to difficult negotiations. I think we need to discuss what modifications to our family relationships would be necessary to move forward constructively, he said. Obviously, our previous approaches were based on incorrect assumptions that created problems for everyone involved. What changes would you need to see to feel respected and valued as a family member? His question was framed in business terms, but it represented a genuine inquiry rather than an attempt to minimize the situation. I had prepared for this moment by developing specific, measurable requirements that would prevent vague promises from substituting for concrete behavioral changes. I need authentic inclusion in family decision-making processes, particularly those that affect financial or social planning, I began. I need recognition of my professional expertise and appropriate consultation when family members face business or investment decisions where my knowledge could be valuable. I need an end to service-oriented role assignments during family gatherings and social events. The requirements were straightforward, though they would necessitate fundamental changes to established family patterns. Most importantly, I continued, I need evidence that these changes represent genuine shifts in how you view my position within the family, not just temporary accommodations to manage a difficult situation. Patricia nodded thoughtfully, apparently recognizing that superficial compliance would not address the underlying relationship damage. How would we demonstrate that our changes are genuine rather than just strategic responses to our current circumstances? Her question suggested that she understood the difference between authentic respect and calculated cooperation. Through consistency over time, and through your willingness to defend my position when I'm not present to advocate for myself. The test of genuine change will be whether you modify your behavior when there's no immediate benefit to treating me respectfully. The conversation continued for another hour as we established specific protocols for family interactions, financial discussions, and social planning that would reflect my actual status rather than their previous misconceptions. The agreements were detailed enough to prevent misunderstandings while providing clear benchmarks for evaluating whether promised changes were being implemented authentically. As the meeting concluded, Marcus approached me privately while his family members gathered their materials and prepared to leave. "I want you to know that I understand how badly I failed you as a husband. I allowed my family to treat you terribly because I was too weak to challenge their assumptions or defend your position. I'm committed to changing that pattern going forward." His recognition was important, though our marriage would require extensive rebuilding to repair the damage caused by years of his complicity in his family's treatment. "I appreciate your acknowledgement, Marcus. The question is whether you're capable of maintaining that perspective when it requires you to confront your family's behavior directly, rather than just supporting me in private conversations." Emma lingered after the others had departed, apparently wanting to have a more personal conversation about the revelations of the weekend. "I keep thinking about all the times we treated you like you were lucky to be included in family activities, when the reality is that you were more successful than any of us and could have bought and sold our entire social circle." Her perspective was accurate, though I hadn't acquired my financial position for the purpose of social dominance. Success isn't about demonstrating superiority, Emma. It's about building something meaningful and being recognized for your actual capabilities, rather than being dismissed based on superficial characteristics. She nodded with apparent understanding. "I'd like to learn more about your business activities, if you're willing to share. I think I could benefit from understanding how you built something so substantial while dealing with all the challenges we were creating for you." Her request represented the kind of genuine interest that her family had never shown during 4 years of marriage. "I'd be happy to discuss my work with you, as long as you're approaching it from authentic curiosity, rather than just trying to repair our relationship through temporary attention." As the last family member departed, I stood at my windows looking out over Manhattan, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred since Christmas Eve dinner 5 days earlier. The woman who had been handed a mop and bucket by her condescending mother-in-law had revealed herself as the financial power behind her husband's family's continued comfort and social position. The Whitmore family would need time to adjust to their new understanding of our relationship dynamics, but the foundation had been established for interactions based on reality rather than misconception. Whether they would sustain the behavioral changes they had committed to implementing remained to be seen, but they now understood that their continued financial security depended on treating me with the respect that my actual position warranted. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia, sent from her car as the family drove back to their estate. "Thank you for your patience with our family's learning process. I look forward to getting to know the remarkable woman Marcus married, rather than the limited version I had convinced myself you represented." The message suggested genuine recognition rather than diplomatic courtesy, though time would reveal whether her understanding translated into sustained behavioral change. As I settled into my home office to review the financial markets and prepare for the upcoming week's business activities, I felt the satisfaction that comes from finally operating as my authentic self rather than a carefully edited version designed to accommodate other people's limitations. The emerald bracelet I had worn throughout our family meeting caught the afternoon light, reminding me that strength comes not from accepting others' definitions of your capabilities, but from demonstrating those capabilities with quiet confidence, until recognition becomes unavoidable. The Whitmore family had learned that lesson the hard way, but perhaps that would make their education more lasting and meaningful. 6 months later, the changes had proven both genuine and sustainable. Patricia had become one of my most enthusiastic advocates, introducing me to social contacts as a brilliant investor whose insights had proven invaluable to her understanding of financial markets. Harrison regularly consulted with me about business decisions and had begun referring legal clients who needed sophisticated financial structuring for their transactions. Emma had enrolled in graduate finance courses and credited our conversations about investment strategy with inspiring her career pivot toward sustainable development financing. Even James had modified his approach, though he remained more formal in his interactions than the rest of the family. Marcus and I had rebuilt our marriage on a foundation of genuine partnership, rather than assumed hierarchy, with him taking active pride in my professional achievements rather than viewing them as competition for family attention. The relationship required ongoing work, but it was now based on authentic understanding rather than carefully maintained illusions. The most satisfying change was that family gatherings had evolved into genuine celebrations where my contributions were valued and my presence was appreciated rather than merely tolerated. I no longer spent holiday dinners managing logistics while others enjoyed social recognition, because the family had learned to distribute responsibilities equitably and recognize everyone's unique capabilities. The financial arrangements had stabilized into mutually beneficial partnerships that provided the Whitmore family with favorable terms while offering me solid returns on strategic investments. They had gradually improved their financial management practices, reducing their dependence on credit while increasing their asset values through more disciplined spending and better investment decisions. Most importantly, I had learned that demanding respect for your actual capabilities isn't selfishness or aggression, but rather an essential component of authentic relationships that serve everyone's long-term interests. The woman who had accepted a mop and bucket in silence had transformed into someone who insisted on recognition without apology, creating space not just for her own success, but for genuine family connections based on truth rather than convenient fictions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.